All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of the Leo Beck Institute Book Club. Happy to see everyone here today. Today, we're going to be discussing the novel of Legacy, which is by Sybille Bedford. And we have with us as our guest today, Brenda Wineapple. And I'm going to introduce Brenda to all of us. And then Brenda will give some opening remarks, about 10 minutes or so, and which will be recorded. And then we'll open it up for our discussion, which as usual is not recorded. So let me introduce Brenda Wineapple. She is an award-winning author. Her books include The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson, and The Dream of a Just Nation, which was named one of the 10 best nonfiction works of 2019 by the New York Times. And also her book, White Heat, The Friendship of Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award. The recipient of a Pushcart Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, among other honors. Brenda Wineapple lives in New York City with her husband, the composer Michael Delara. She is author of the foreword for the New York Review of Books edition of A Legacy. That's the edition I have, and probably many of us have this as well. So this version, though any was allowable. So Brenda, I'll let you begin your opening remarks and presentation, and you let me know when you're done, and then we'll begin the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Monica. Thank everyone for coming today. I'm very excited to talk with you and to listen to you and hear you talk, because this novel, A Legacy, is one of my very favorites. And Sybille Bedford was and remains a very special person in my life. If you read the introduction to this edition of A Legacy, you would know that I knew Sybille. I'm very fortunate to know her. She was one of the most supportive writers that I've ever met. She was incredibly gracious and a lot of fun. I first came across her, not her, but A Legacy, when I moved to New York in the 80s, and I was looking for an apartment, as we all do when we moved to New York from elsewhere, and I was very discouraged. And a friend sent me to a friend's basement apartment, I remember, on Central Park West. He was going to go out to California. It's kind of a creepy place, but nonetheless, and because it was underground. And he was getting rid of his books, and we were talking. He's a very nice person. And he pulled off the shelf A Legacy, and he said, "Have you read this?" And the point of fact, not only had I not read it, but I hadn't even heard of it. And that's one of the interesting things about Sybille's work, is that it goes in and out of fashion in the United States. She's very well known, or was very well known, in England, where she received the British Order of Literary something or other, which is given to very few writers. So she was honored often in her adopted country. But here, despite the fact that part of her novel Jigsaw was excerpted in the New Yorker, or other accolades, or that she was very well connected to other writers, as I said, her work comes and goes, and I don't really understand why that's the case, but that's another issue. So this young man, Tom Timmons was his name, gave me A Legacy, and I didn't take the apartment, but I took the book and I read it, and I was completely overwhelmed with what I consider to be one of the most unusual, best novels of the latter part of the 20th century. This was still the latter part of the 20th century, but I still feel that way. And then some years later, when I was researching my first book, which is a biography of Janet Flanner, who was the Paris correspondent for the New Yorker for many years, and though she was younger than Sybille Bedford, they knew each other pretty well in Paris. So I went to visit Sybille Bedford in London, where she was then living, and interviewed her. And for whatever reason, we started to talk. It was a kind of, when you meet people and you find just a sudden bond between you and that person, you don't know really why it happens. Maybe it was the scotch. I don't know. I missed my bus back to where I was staying. I had to take a cab. We became very good friends. I have an entire correspondence with her since that time, which was, I think, probably in around 87 or 88. And in fact, and I think I put this in the introduction, 9/11 in the city, she was actually, this tells you something that I don't want to say, but in any event, she was the only one of my friends from outside the city who called to see if I was all right and if my husband was all right, which really tells you something, not about, it tells you something about the other people that I know, but it really tells you something very, very special about her. And I think much of what it tells you is how sensitive she was to the fact that she herself had lived through, as all of you know, a really very frightening century where she was, if not a direct observer, an indirect observer, given her own background. She emerged from that century, despite the fact that she was born in Germany, despite the fact that her passport, or German passport, was confiscated, despite the fact that Berlin in the 30s, namely Hitler, hated her and wouldn't let her back into the country, despite the fact that her very apparently beautiful mother had become a morphine addict in the south of France, where they were more or less hiding in the 30s when Sybille was a young woman. Despite all of that, despite the fact that she became a refugee virtually in both England and the United States, despite an arranged marriage that actually worked out so that she could get a British passport, despite all of that, she really felt that she escaped the century and the horrors of the century relatively unscathed, which was true, and in a sense accounts for what I think might be considered survivor's guilt. Her last book, written when she was in her 90s and could barely see, although her health overall was pretty good, her last book documents some of that. Her last book was a memoir when she was more or less open about her past, and in it she writes, I think very powerfully, that nothing happens without consequences. That's the epigraph of the book, and it was published in 2005, just the year before she died, and that was just before she had turned 95. So as she lived a very long time, she saw quite a bit in that lifetime. And what's interesting too about her is that in a sense, she came to publishing fairly late. She didn't publish a book until she was 42. That was in 1953. That's a book which I really recommend to you. It's a real tour de force. It's something much more than a travel book. It's called A Visit to Don Ottavio, a Mexican version. And in that, a Mexican journey, rather, sorry. And in that book, it is a travel book. She goes with her friend Esther Murphy to Mexico, but it's much more than that. It's a real meditation on violence and nationalism and friendship. And that really started her. And when she came back to, she was in the United States at that time and then went back to Europe, excuse me, she was ready to publish a novel, which is what she had always wanted to do. And that novel is a legacy, which was she helped publish, excuse me, helped to publish by the backing of several friends. Sybille always had rather wealthy friends who were willing to support her. It's something that was very good fortune for her. But again, it tells you something about her character, that so many people who were themselves talented really believed in her, like Aldous and Maria Huxley. And when she finished that book, one of her friends passed it to another friend who gave it to the novelist Evelyn Waugh, who wrote in The Spectator that he thought that it was a wonderful book. It was a new artist, and he also assumed, because it was so good, that it had to be written by a cosmopolitan military man whose lapses in Catholic dogma might be excused. That's a direct quote, which is pretty funny when you think about it. It finally came out here and in Britain in 1956, 3 years after A Sudden View, or A Visit to Donna Tevye. What's interesting is Harper's, interesting to me anyway, was that Harper's publisher who'd published the Mexican book turned this down, turned A Legacy down. But somehow it got in the hands of Robert Gottlieb, the renowned editor. Actually, in his recent memoir, he writes a little bit about Sybille Bedford. He saw what a remarkable, I think, book it is. I hope you share my view of it. And published it, and was never really sorry that he did at all. And it was a real critical success. Often, as you might imagine, critical successes don't necessarily sell a lot of books, but nonetheless, it launched Sybille on her career. As an aside, I should point out something else about Sybille Bedford that I find very interesting, and that is, she cannot be easily classified. She thinks of herself, and she was a novelist. But as I said, at the end of her life, she wrote a memoir. In between novels, well, as I said, she started with almost a travel book. Then she wrote 3 novels, 4, I consider the more recent one, A Jigsaw. But she also wrote quite a bit of journalism, what we consider journalism. And the reason I find that very interesting is that she loved language. She felt very comfortable in writing in English. She was multilingual, as you would assume, because she'd been born in Germany and lived so long in France, and also knew Italian. She lived in Rome many times during her life. But she found English, the English, to be the language that she preferred to write in. She found it quite beautiful. So, and of course, it has that sort of historical tradition. Shakespeare, Chaucer, Jane Austen, whom she loved, Virginia Woolf, who was at the wedding reception of her and Walter Bedford, believe it or not. So this is a language that she preferred, and she covered the trial in Germany of some of the staff who had worked at Auschwitz. She did that. She hated doing that, but she felt it should be covered because it was the first trial of its kind that took place in Germany. She often spent a lot of time at the Old Bailey in London. She felt listening to trials was great experience for a novelist because of the dialogue, because of the creation of character. She has a wonderful comparative study of different justice systems in places like England, Austria, Germany, France, and there's one other that I forget at this time. So she had a range that we often don't associate, I think, in America anyway, with writers. So to turn to A Legacy itself, from my point of view, and I really love all of her work. Jigsaw is also very autobiographical, much more so than this book. But if we turn to A Legacy, we really see, I think, to a certain extent, it's obviously about very, very many things. But from my point of view, and obviously we're going to hear your points of view, and I can't wait. because I'm sure they're varied. But my point of view, one of the things that strikes me among others that are really very important is that it's about memory, it's about family, it's about history, it's about nationhood, but it's also about memory. And, as she writes in that book, we're said to reinvent our memories. We often rearrange them. Did we hear this then? Do we remember saying that? Or do we remember being told that? And so what she does in this book is invent a narrator, the young girl, who is trying to piece together what it was she heard about the family past. And the family past is obviously set within a very complicated German culture, German, Prussian, Southern German, and trying to reflect and muse on what that actually means, what that inheritance brings to us, because to a large extent, we are all the legatees. We all have something more or less that we've inherited, and sometimes we know what that is, sometimes we don't know what that is, but in any case, in all of these cases, we are trying to understand how the past impinges on and creates the present, and what our attitudes, moral and otherwise, to it should be. And as she says also, the narrator says in that book, she says, I don't remember, or I don't know a time when I was not imprinted with the experience of others. And the story of others, she says, is in a sense my story. But it's also, as we know, having read the book, that my story in this particular case is the story of Russian pride, political scandal, anti-Semitism, negligence, and all of that is not only the narrator's legacy, but to my mind, the legacy of the 20th century. That's what we who are shaped by it, and we cannot help but be shaped by it. That's what we've inherited in our task, the moral task. It's a task for us as readers, as she gives it to us, is to understand our own relation to it and through the characters that she gives us. So she also says, thus, the memory of the boy who is a man, of course, that's the child's uncle, the narrator's uncle, the boy who is a man and died before I was as much as born, and of the school I never saw, were part of the secret reality of my own past. So in that sense, too, our legacies are filled with those secret realities of that which occurred before we were born. And she, as narrator, can't really escape it. And in trying to figure out what that means, something else I think occurs in what she says also in that book, which I find very moving, is really very moving. She says, life is never, or as her mother, I think the character Carolyn says, life is never as good, is never as bad or as good as one thinks. And that makes life difficult, of course, because we don't live in a Manichaean world. We don't live in a world of good or bad often. And so in that sense, that legacy is the story, and it really bequeaths to us, a 20th century parable about the world in which we live. You all know, I think, the plot. I won't go into that, but I think it's true that, when the book came out, Aldous Huxley, who was a friend of hers, said it's an unclassifiable book. And I think that's true too. That also, I think, relates to the kind of writer that Sybille Bedford was. He says it was a historical novel, certainly, because this is a novel that is not set in any present, not Sybille Bedford's present, but in the past. And at the same time, it's a study of character. Absolutely. I mean, the characters, I think, again, it's me speaking, are unforgettable, particularly the character Jules with his two pet, the beau Jules, with his two pet monkeys, and his shot, his, and I think Sybille Bedford once said that her father they really did have a donkey, and her father always tipped his hat to the donkey. But he was a gambler and a womanizer. I mean, nothing, as I said, is good or bad. So we have this character analysis, these characters, these odd characters, and this brilliant set of portraits that is encased in a series of family indiscretions, secrets, lies, that I think are very complicated. I think the book is very rich. The other thing I would say, and then I'll stop because you want to talk, but the other thing I'll say is that it's really, I think, a combination of styles. Some of it's very lyrical. Some of it seems perhaps to a modern reader dense. I think it's all very beautiful. I think, and some of what may be a little disconcerting is the use of dialogue. There are long pages of dialogue, and you have to get oriented to figure out who's speaking when. And it's very snappy dialogue. I think she takes that style from Ivy Compton Burnett. But once you get the rhythm of it, I think it works really very, very nicely in that particular sense. So I think that's enough of me.
Please like and subscribe to receive more content from the Leo Beck Institute.